Great.
Yep,
Okay. All right.
we
Well,
are.
I want to welcome everyone this morning. We have a very good webinar thanks to Paul Hyun. I want to mention a few things before we get started. One is that on Wednesday night, we will have a webinar about buying a townhouse in Brooklyn. It'll be hosted by two team members, Daniela Guetta and Brian Blessinger, and that'll be 5 o'clock on Wednesday, so join us. I think it's important before we start each webinar to talk a little bit about what's going on in this country, which we've been doing, especially this past Wednesday night. We had a great conversation about issues of race in this country. And I guess today I just want to talk a little bit about policing and race, because it's a huge issue, and it's not about good or bad people. It's about really what we've allowed in terms of really sort of like a culture of violence against people of color in this country, really since our history began. That's what this country is based on. And now we really need serious measures. There are plenty of police that are honorable people and act correctly, but the problem is there are a lot of people that don't, and they're way too protected. And even we see in Buffalo, where these two police officers knocked a 75-year-old man to the ground with blood gushing out of his head, and they defend his actions. These actions are indefensible. And until we start taking serious measures to make sure everyone in this society should be accountable, including police officers. And it's about time we did something about it. Just my 2 cents this morning. So this morning we have a very interesting webinar, which Paul Hyun organized because he has a special relationship to the speaker, who happens to be his brother. So I'll hand this over to Paul. Thank you very much, Paul.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Scott. So we've been planning this for a little while. We thought it would be interesting as the pandemic continues, and we look for some sort of end to it, what that looks like. And also because there's going to be news that comes out over the next months, and there has been news. There's been a lot of news about different drugs, vaccines under trial, stuff like that. And I thought it would be, since I have a background, my undergraduate degree was in biology, and I studied some things like pharmacology and virology and stuff, and immunology. I know a little bit about how drug tests work and about the difference between hospital studies and drug tests. But my brother really is an expert. He is a clinical trial manager. He works in the Pacific Northwest. I'll let him explain what a clinical trial manager is, and we'll have a discussion about coronavirus drugs and vaccines. And hopefully this will help people understand when they see news about some sort of treatment, if it was a hospital study or if it comes out of a drug trial, how you can understand the difference between those critically and have a better understanding of what's happening in terms of medicine around this. And then also about vaccines and when we can potentially expect a vaccine for coronavirus and what that vaccine might be able to do for us. Sound good? So, Phil, you there?
Okay. Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you just fine. Could you talk a little bit about, first of all, what is what you do? What is a clinical trial manager? And
Sure.
And then what are clinical trials?
Sure. Okay. So my job as a clinical trial manager is to basically, so clinical trials have to follow very strict protocols and FDA regulations. So my job is basically to make sure that the investigators, which are typically hospitals or clinics, where the doctors are following the protocol very closely so that the data is robust. So I'll go into the hospitals or clinics and I will review all their patient charts and make sure that the patients that are in the trial, first of all, met all the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the trial, and then they're being treated exactly per the protocol, and that the data is being collected accurately. And then on the side, also that they're following and submitting all the regulatory documentation and reports and things like that with independent review boards that are reviewing safety. And there's various moving parts in a clinical trial. So my job is just to make sure that everything is moving smoothly and accurately, and so that if and when there's an FDA inspection, there won't be any issues that would cause a disqualification in the data that they've collected. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what I do. Since the lockdown, working remotely has been a challenge. I've only started being able to go back into a couple of the sites in Washington State, but California is still completely closed. So I have been doing clinical trials in the COVID-19 vaccine, and also in one of the treatment studies where they were studying remdesivir, and I think that's been in the news. There's been some positive results from those studies. So I've been doing the monitoring remote, basically trying to do everything I can, via looking at electronic medical records. In some cases, the staff at the hospitals are actually holding their phones in WebEx meetings with me over the data. It's pretty painstaking, but that's, it's got to be done. So that's how we've been doing it so far. So.
Okay. Could you talk a little bit about the difference between a drug trial and a hospital study?
Sure. So clinical trials are sort of the gold standard for research, because we can control. It offers the highest amount of control in terms of variables, confounding factors. We bring patients in, they have to meet very strict inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. We track everything that goes in and out of them. Adverse events from, headaches, slivers, to what they call severe adverse events that may or may not be related to the treatment. Everything is just very, very tightly controlled, so that we're really looking at the effects of that one thing that we're studying, that one treatment, or that one compound that we're studying. So that's why clinical trials offer the most reliable data in terms of whether or not something is effective, as opposed to hospital studies, which in general are more observational. So there are basically four different types of observational studies that they do in hospitals. One is case studies, where they're just looking at the clinical course of a group of individuals and seeing what happens to them. So they're not changing any particular intervention. They're just looking at what's happening to a group of people. And then there's cross-sectional studies. Those tend to be more looking at doing chart reviews and looking at exposures and outcomes. And it's typically looking at an entire population, not just populations with a specific illness. So we'll look at the entire population to determine like prevalence of a disease or risk ratios, but not necessarily cause and effect. So like if you're looking for what the risk is of getting COVID-19, or the prevalence and things like that, that comes from these cross-sectional studies. And because we don't have a lot of data, that information is just really, it's not very accurate. Let's put it that way. they do the best they can with what information they can gather. But because the information, of course, is determined by who's submitting the information and how they're collecting it, we don't really know the accuracy.
Like large scale anecdotal information?
Well, I mean, we can get information from major cities on, infection rates and things like that. But I mean, we're not getting information from all the, tertiary, secondary, tertiary, smaller hospitals across the country. I mean, it's more difficult. And we can't really control how they themselves are determining whether or not something is COVID-19 related or not. So there's just so many, it's just not a controlled study. It's just gathering information and doing the best you can with the information that you've got.
Mm-hmm.
There are also something called case control studies. This is where you're basically looking at two groups that have different outcomes, and so you're basically you're trying to figure out what it is about their risk factors that determines the outcome. It's typically retrospective, and it's a fairly common type of study where you already know what the outcomes of the people are, and so you're just basically looking back to see, okay, what are the risk factors that this group that got the disease had and this group that didn't get the disease had.
Okay.
And then the fourth one is cohort studies, and those are just like long-term studies, like longitudinal studies that take years, where you're looking at a particular risk factor and then you want to see what happens. Like, okay, these people are living very close to 3 Mile Island, so we're going to follow them and we're going to see what happens in their life. So those kind of studies, while they can still be very accurate, their accuracy depends on how well they're designed in terms of considering confounding factors. And there's so many confounding factors, so studies have to be very carefully designed in order for the results to be accurate. Yeah. So that's why clinical trials really are the most accurate way to determine whether or not a drug is or is not effective. So
how many people do you need to study for it to have a statistically meaningful result?
So there are different phases in clinical trials. Phase 1 studies are where you're basically taking healthy individuals and just trying to see whether or not the drug has any adverse effects. And you're also maybe trying to determine the maximum tolerated dose. And typically with those kind of studies, you don't need a lot of patients, maybe 100 patients. In terms of when you're dealing with a really dangerous disease that has high mortality, you may not go through as many people. You may test, maybe 40 people to see what the effect is. So things are definitely accelerated with COVID-19 just because of the high mortality. Mm-hmm. Then you move into phase 2, where you're looking at whether or not it actually provides protection, or if it treats the disease that you're studying, if it's effective. So phase 2, you're looking for effectiveness, and you're also looking at safety. You're still looking at safety, and you're still looking at, you might be testing like a couple doses instead of like a whole range of doses. And that typically can be 600 to 1,000 people. So it's definitely a larger amount of people. When you move into, when everything checks out and you're finding that it's effective, then you move into phase 3, and that's like thousands of people, like 40,000 people or 50,000, it's tens of thousands of people at that point, where you're getting a really large collection of data where you're looking at the effectivity of the drug on the disease. And then there's phase 4, but that's like post-marketing. That's like, okay, you know, we have this approved drug, let's try it on something else. I wanted to talk a little bit about hydroxychloroquine, chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine in terms of how those studies were done. I don't know if that would be of interest.
Yeah,
But that's like post-marketing. That's like, okay.
Go for it. Go for it.
Okay. So, so chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, they are approved drugs. And so, but they're not approved for COVID-19. But because they're already approved, they didn't have to go through rigorous testing before they decided that we should try this. Both chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine were found to be effective in preventing viruses from penetrating into cells, but in the lab, not in humans. So based on that evidence, they thought, okay, we should try chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. So the FDA immediately approved use of those drugs as, you know, in an experimental way, in a controlled way, in people with COVID-19. So hospitals started using those two drugs, and they also found that the addition of azithromycin, which is commonly called Z-Pak, also improved the resistance of cells in the petri dish to the virus. So in some cases, they were adding azithromycin to the chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. So the risk of doing this, of course, is that you really, it's very experimental, and you really don't know what's going to happen because you're just, you're starting treatment, and you just have to watch very carefully about what's happening. So early on, I think a lot of investigators started noticing that it wasn't really working, or it wasn't really making a difference. People were still dying. And I think there was a lot of just talk, you know, in terms of, I know that I was talking about it, you know, like, I'm not really seeing much going on with this hydroxychloroquine. But, and I know that UC Davis and UCLA had immediately adopted it as part of their standard of care. Some other places were a little more, they hadn't adopted it yet, like the Washington hospitals. They never used chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine as a standard of care. But anyway, after some time, after a few weeks, there was a study that was, the first study that was done was at the VA hospitals. And that was a retrospective study, an example of an observational study where they just looked at about 300, I think it was 368 veterans, some that were treated with hydroxychloroquine, some didn't get hydroxychloroquine. And they found that the ones that were treated with hydroxychloroquine, 27.8% of those patients died. And of the ones that were not treated with hydroxychloroquine, only 11% died. So more than 2 times the amount of people died that were treated with hydroxychloroquine. So again, they did their best to reduce confounding factors and things like that. But again, it was a retrospective study. So
right.
then,
I mean, if it's a study like that, isn't it possible that people who were more likely to die got the hydroxychloroquine? The people who were more likely to die anyways got the hydroxychloroquine, and I mean, isn't that part of the problem with hospital studies?
Yeah, you can't control for necessarily what the decision-making process was in why someone got hydroxychloroquine and why someone didn't.
Right, and when you do a drug trial, who gets it and who doesn't is randomized, right?
That's correct. It's randomized, and it's also double blind, so we don't know who. double blind in a clinical trial means that no one knows what anyone is getting.
So even the doctor doesn't know if they're
Even the
getting placebo or the drug.
That's correct. Especially the doctor doesn't know, because that eliminates any bias that could be entered into the study if that investigator is looking for effectiveness.
Right, which is what hospital studies completely lack.
Correct. Sorry, I didn't mention that earlier, but yes, clinical trials are typically placebo-controlled, double-blind studies.
Right.
Now, one of the studies that we're doing with remdesivir, we already did a study with remdesivir versus placebo, and we found that remdesivir was more effective in treating COVID-19 than the placebo. It shortened the duration of the infection, and it also shortened the severity, or it lessened the severity of the symptoms. So in that
So those
trial,
are like phase 1 results that are already announced?
what's that?
Those are phase 1 results that are already announced?
Yes. So, and well, actually it's phase 2, because remdesivir is already approved for the treatment of a different disease. So.
Oh, right. And phase 1 is about the actual safety of the drug generally, right?
Correct. So we already know the safety profile of remdesivir, so we moved straight into phase 2. But the trial was designed to be flexible. So now that we found remdesivir to be more effective than the placebo, now remdesivir has become the control. So everyone gets remdesivir. It would be unethical to treat anyone with placebo now that we know that remdesivir is more effective. So remdesivir becomes the control, and now we're testing remdesivir plus so remdesivir versus remdesivir plus a new addition that we've added to the study, which is a drug called baricitinib, which is it is an anti-inflammatory drug for the immune system. So we're trying to.
Is that the one I mentioned last night that I had read about, that there was like some sort of hospital study that showed a big drop in fatalities of patients who were on ventilators?
That's correct. Yeah. So we can talk about this a little bit later in terms of where we are with treatments and things like that. But yes, there's been some really good information on how to reduce mortality due to COVID-19.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so where were we? Oh yeah, talking about hydroxychloroquine. Okay, so then they did another study in Brazil, and this was actually a prospective study where they gave half the patients high dose chloroquine and half the patients low dose chloroquine, and they all got azithromycin, and they're just looking at, is more better or less, because it's known that hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine have some negative effects on the heart. Those drugs kind of mess up the electrical system of the heart. So AFib was a common adverse event. So they tried it out in a high dose and a low dose, and they found out that in the high dose group, 17% of the people died, and 25% of them died from heart failure.
Oh my gosh.
And they found in the low dose that 13.5% died, and that was no different than the general population. So they stopped the study.
Right.
Then there was a third study in New York City. It was like 1,300 patients, and they found that of the people treated with hydroxy, 32% of them died, and of the people not treated with hydroxy, 15% died. So over twice as many people, again, died who were taking hydroxy. So at that,
Okay.
and then at
Still,
the
that's
same time,
hospital studies, right? Like, that's still hospital studies. I mean, are there
that's right.
actual drug trials happening?
Yeah, so the WHO decided at this point, okay, we actually need to do this as a controlled clinical trial. So as much as they could, they got 6 continents basically on board. They tested 96,000 patients. 15,000 of the patients got chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine, and 81,000 of them got nothing. So of the patients that got nothing, only 9% of them died. And of the people that got hydroxychloroquine, 18% died. So again, figure of 2 times the amount died when they got hydroxy. That was 18% of the people died when they got hydroxychloroquine. When they got hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, 24% of those people died. So the combination was even worse.
Wow.
So at that point,
Terrible.
the WHO said no one should be treating anybody with hydroxychloroquine.
Mm-hmm.
So that's straight out.
Right.
Okay. So those are examples of those are examples of typical observational studies where you're basically looking at, okay, here's a bunch of people that got the same thing, here's a bunch of people that have the same disease. We treated them in 2 different ways. What is the result?
Right. But with a drug trial, you carefully select who is in the population that's being tested, right?
That's right. So, like, for instance, in the remdesivir trials, we're carefully, basically, we're not carefully choosing. People are coming in, they've got COVID-19.
Yeah.
But
what about for a vaccine
while they're in the
trial?
hospital, say that again?
What about for a vaccine trial? Maybe we should talk about that.
Okay. Well, I was just about to say, the people that come in with COVID-19, they are, asked to participate in the study. That's part of the informed consent process. They join into the study, and from then on out, everything is very carefully controlled in terms of how they're treated.
Right.
So they can eliminate as many confounding factors as possible.
Right. Got it.
There's like 90 different hospitals in the U.S. that are participating in this study. Everyone is treating every patient exactly the same way.
Right. Can we move on to talk about vaccines and vaccine trials?
Sure.
So I think maybe you explain what are the phases there, but also I think everyone would like to know about how long to expect it to take before we have a vaccine.
Okay, so on average, vaccines take about 10 years to go from phase 1 to approval. They take a long time.
Why is that?
Because phase 1 studies are typically not that long for a vaccine, but phase 2, where you're looking for effectiveness, can take a long time, because vaccines, the purpose of the design of the vaccine is to last for a while. So the vaccine will take at least a year to show effectiveness, and that's phase 2.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then you add on once that study is done, it has to be submitted to the FDA. They have to review it. They look at all the data. They come back. It's like another year, because there's sort of like a backlog of things they need to look at. So of course, with COVID-19, everything's accelerated. But I'm just talking about in general, in a non-emergency sort of situation.
Right. So what about with COVID-19?
Yeah, and then you go into phase 2, which again will take at least a year. Typically, these studies go for 2 years because we want to see, how long people show protective antibodies as a result of their vaccination. And then you'll add on a year after that for FDA to review and get back to you before you can move to phase 3. So it's just a very slow sort of moving process. Now, when you hear on the news that, we could have a COVID-19 vaccine ready by the end of 2020, that's a pipe dream. There's no way that's going to happen. Most medical experts are saying 18 months, and that is in itself is super, super, super accelerated process. I mean, that's if everything goes perfect, and of course the FDA is going to review all the data immediately, and then if the vaccine, and then it takes a year for the vaccine to be produced. We're looking at least 18 months before even that super accelerated process can happen, and that vaccine won't be widely available. I mean, we're talking about making millions or billions of doses. So most likely the people that will get vaccinated early on, once the vaccine is shown to be safe and effective, will be like, frontline healthcare workers and people that have a high exposure.
So what do you mean by everything goes perfect? That means the vaccine works, or first of all, people don't have adverse effects from the vaccine. It builds up antibodies and they last.
Yes. So say we find that this particular vaccine isn't particularly it doesn't hurt people. It doesn't have a lot of adverse effects. We may find that we may find that it doesn't produce any antibodies, or that the antibodies only last for 6 months. There are a number of different ways to look at the protective factors. There's different types of immunity that people have. It might increase the number of flag cells in terms of like, oh hey, this cell's infected, come kill it, to the immune system. Or it might increase the number of actual killer cells, the T cells that actually come in and kill. So there's a lot of different factors involved in studying the effect of a vaccine, and those all need to be analyzed. We collect blood samples from people at every visit. So I can tell you, it's public information that the Moderna vaccine, they did release publicly information about the first 8 subjects that were treated. They were called sentinel subjects because this is a brand new drug, so they just did it on 8 people first. The patients are showing, they're showing neutralizing antibodies that are equivalent to people that have been infected with SARS-CoV-2. So it's promising. Now we just have to continue testing them to see how long that protection lasts. And you had asked a really interesting question the other day to me, whether or not, based on, now, how long are they going to wait before they decide, okay, maybe we should vaccinate, more people because of the mortality of COVID-19.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question. I read something yesterday about how some people are advocating for what is it called? They're advocating for challenge trials. So, which is basically you accelerate the process by intentionally infecting people and then vaccinating them and seeing what happens.
You mean vaccinating people and then intentionally exposing them?
Correct. Sorry. Yeah. So that's called a challenge trial. In this case, because the mortality rate of COVID-19 is so high, they're not authorizing any studies like that yet.
Right. Yeah.
But if it was higher, if the mortality rate, I think, was a lot higher, who knows? Maybe they would. That movie. What was that movie?
What, like Outbreak or something?
It wasn't Outbreak. It was the other one. That was very very similar to this situation, where basically the vaccine, the scientist working on the vaccine, basically vaccinated herself with the experimental drug because it didn't kill the monkey,
right?
And then exposed herself, and it worked. And so then they immediately started. I mean, that's sci-fi, but
Yeah.
it's the same idea. They're not at that point yet because it's not that severe, but I wouldn't necessarily rule out that they could say, okay, we're seeing enough protection in people at 1 year to start giving it to frontline healthcare workers or something like that.
Right.
I mean
that's what I was wondering about yesterday, right? And I think this will have to be the last question, but like, you're talking about how, like, with a vaccine trial, they want to see that it lasts, like the antibodies last for a long time, right? Like,
right.
2 years. But what if they find that the antibodies persist for like 8 months? Is it possible that, like, I don't know, the government or just the public says, give it to us now?
Sure, it's possible. Once they have the data, the FDA will review the data and they may say, okay, let's go with this because we can get at least 8 months protection, and people that want the vaccine can get an injection every 6 months or something like that. It's possible.
Okay. Let's see. I mean, those are I think the main questions people want to know about is how soon can we have something, like
right,
a vaccine. So,
well, I think that brings us to current treatments and the clinical trials that we're doing with these drugs that reduce the cytokines in the blood. So basically, what's been identified as the biggest killer due to SARS-CoV-2 is that it causes what they're calling a cytokine storm, which is they're finding in these observational studies that people that are dying have a lot of these proteins in their bodies that are created as an immune response to an attack. So what's happening is, for whatever reason, the SARS-CoV-2 is causing people's immune systems to basically go crazy, and they start producing these proteins that are basically dissolving their organs. So they go into multiple organ failure, or at least in many cases, because the virus is in the lungs, it's causing cytokine storm in the lungs, which is causing the body to basically attack the lung cells, and the lung cells are dissolving, and people can't breathe. And even on a ventilator, it doesn't really matter because there's no oxygen being transferred to the blood because the alveoli have been destroyed, so the people are dying. So they found this. They found out about these high levels of cytokines, and they've been testing people with already approved drugs like baricitinib and these other citinib drugs that were originally developed for rheumatoid arthritis and also different types of cancers that also show these elevated cytokine levels. And they're finding them to be very effective in reducing the mortality. So where we may not have a vaccine that can provide protection to people from getting it, at least maybe we're finding something that we can reduce the mortality. So we are doing clinical trials in that. Yeah, we just started doing the addition of baricitinib to remdesivir about 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago.
Yep. So now there are tons of trials going on. There's at least 10 vaccine trials going on. I know that AstraZeneca is doing something with Oxford, and they're already in phase 3 with their vaccine study. All kinds of treatment studies going on. I feel really good about these cytokine cytokine drugs, because they, I mean, yeah, you don't want to get sick, but you don't want to die, and that's the biggest thing. So this new treatment will certainly, hopefully be, I should say hopefully be approved before a vaccine is.
Cool. Okay.
Great. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions.
That was great.
Scott, do you have anything to say?
Hope that helps.
Yes, thank you, Philip. That was really informative, and I think information that people really want to know. And I wanted to mention one other thing before we wrap up, which is that if all goes well, real estate agents are part of phase 2 in New York State, and that we're hoping we'll be able to be back showing houses and apartments on June 23rd in a very careful, limited way. So we'll probably have a discussion about that as well very shortly, but I just wanted people to be aware of that. So I would say everyone have a good Sunday, stay safe, and Philip, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
You're welcome. I was glad to do it.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
All right,
Bye.
have a great day. Bye-bye.